Hello, how are you? I hope you're enjoying a nice afternoon. It's kind of chilly out, and maybe you're having some afternoon coffee like I am, and thinking about cage bird. I've been prepping because I know that a few of you have some questions about cage bird and where we're going to take it with our paper. And I want to kind of give you some samples. What I have done is take some layered notes for the text. And by layered notes, I mean doing a literal level, an interpretive level, and then a critical thinking level. On the text itself, which seems kind of meticulous and maybe kind of a lot, but doing notes like this can help you really understand the text at those levels and be able to use it later on because your brain is just processing this information. It kind of puts things into a more of a concrete way of thinking. So I've got some samples I want to show you, and then I have a sample of brainstorming and some other considerations to kind of help get the ideas rolling a little bit for your papers. So let's get started. I'll change to my little screen here for you. Okay, so here is some notes that says up here literal level. And what I have done is just kind of take a look at the text itself. So like things like the action verbs that are used in for the free bird. FB for me is free bird. And then I have down here action verbs for the cage bird. If we look at, I'm not going to go through all of this, but if we look at things like the leaps on the back of the wind, so he's flying on wind currents, he's free to go wherever he wants, and most students would say that that would be kind of a definition of freedom. You know, the free bird, he's got kind of an easy life, and it seems as though everything is given to him, so maybe he might take it for granted. We look at things like his daring to claim the sky, and we might see that as courage or confidence or maybe even some arrogance. But then when he names the sky his own, it could be confidence, maybe a sense of accomplishment, maybe he's just taking advantage of opportunities. But if we look at the caged bird, we see how he paces angrily. He's cramped and he's trapped in prison, this bars of rage. So what does that mean? He might be overwhelmed with anger. So what I want you to do is look at, on this literal level, things that are in the text itself. Kind of think of some identification pieces as I move this forward a little bit. So even things as simple as counting can make a difference. 6 stanzas, because we know that this is a stanza, not a paragraph. 2 of them are about the free bird, so 4 of them are about the cage bird, and what that does is emphasize that cage bird. But at this level, we don't really know why, but we should be asking. I also have things like the definition of free and the definition of freedom. So these are some of those literal kind of notes that can make a difference when we're just starting. Now, I've also got some interpretation notes, and I've labeled it interpretation up here. So I still have those definitions that we just talked about, but what I have done here is look a little bit deeper into the context of the poem, and like leaping on the back of the wind. Okay, the wind doesn't really have a back, but we can kind of imagine a bird taking flight and leaping into the air. So it's kind of personifying the wind. So giving those human characteristic traits to something that is not human. The imagery is also really important here. Freedom of flight, freedom of choice. We look at these kind of textual examples, and I know this gets a little bit blurry. Let me see if I can bring it in just a little bit more. So we look at these textual examples of how this free bird has the freedom to move around. He claims ownership, the right of ownership of the sky. It's not like he just looks up at the sky and says, see that? That one's mine. But then again, maybe he kind of does. So with the cage bird, we see him in this cramped, confining space, this sense of urgency and impatience or anger as he physically stalks around the cage. We see that he's trapped. But in this interpretations level, we want to see, is this a literal trap or maybe a figurative trap? Maybe he's not in jail. Maybe he's not in an actual cage of bars. Maybe there's a little bit more figurative language there. But we see him open his throat to sing, so he's sharing his feelings with others. These are those types of different ideas in the interpretation where we're taking the information that we've got in that literal stage and interpreting that information for meaning. So like the idea of having this line here, I don't know if you noticed, but I have these together. Look at his wings are clipped and his feet are tied. Those are two lines. Did you happen to notice that the second time we see it, it's all in one line? So this combined clipped and tied, maybe the interpretation might be that it's been happening for so long and just kind of a way of life now. Maybe it's more naturalized. Maybe this is normalized for the cage bird. Maybe he's accepting it, but then he still sings. Does that mean he's still hopeful for something? Those things unknown but longed for still? Is that what he's talking about? Is he looking and sending his voice, his messages across the distance, maybe even heard through time? These are some of those things that you want to look at. But I also have some of the questions that you're already familiar with. What is each bird's life like? Is this language literal here, or is it figurative, or maybe a mix of both? Why is the caged bird the only one who sings? Because, you know, the free bird's still a bird. He should be able to sing too. What is the tune, the voice of this caged bird? What is he actually saying? He said he sings of freedom, but what would be possible words, the message itself? And how and why is the voice so important? So we take these ideas, and we can keep going on it, but I want to show you some critical thinking and get this adjusted just a little bit more. Some critical thinking ideas. And what I have done, remember, I claimed my individual as like that outside text. I claimed Martin Luther King Jr., and I have that up here. So I had asked that you kind of apply the poem to some historical figure, and King tends to be one of the easy ones. We know that King spent a lot of time in jail, but we also know that many of his writings and his ideas were sung, figuratively, from behind the jail cell wall. So if you look at his letter from Birmingham jail, he wrote it in solitary confinement. This is that cage bird singing. He didn't know what it is to be completely free, and his rhetoric and the way of life, he didn't know what it was. Even as a free citizen of the United States, he was a black man, so he had cages. His cages might have been figurative, but we also know that they were very literal because he was in jail a lot. You might see that here, this free bird idea might be him playing as a child. And we know that a lot of children, as they play, they're fearless. They're excited with the world and what is happening. We might look at something that, you know, his another breeze. Maybe this is something for education. Education is one way to attain freedom. And for King, education came very easily. In high school, he graduated in 1944 after he skipped the 9th and 11th grade. In Morehouse College, he started out as kind of an unmotivated student, but then he takes a junior year Bible class, and that hit him upside the head, so he decided to follow his father and grandfather into the ministry. He graduates with a sociology degree in 1948. So seriously, he's a smart guy, right? He gets his master's degree in theology. He was a valedictorian in 1951, and in 1955 he gets his PhD. Guys, he was only 25. He was extremely intelligent. That might be part of finding his freedom, finding a dream, claiming his sky, naming it his own. But as a civil rights leader and the president of the civil rights movement, or leading protests for the civil rights movement, he became president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is where he would have to sing. Though he was a free citizen, segregation itself created a lot of different barriers for King and his fellow Black citizens. These are some of those kind of figurative pieces that you could apply to the poem itself, where we could see some outside text happening within the poem. So I also said, you know, King's work towards peaceful protest and racial equity resonates today. That's a little messy, sorry. The US is still racially segregated even in 2021. We have money and political power and housing, healthcare, all these different avenues where people of color are discriminated against. And King would be really upset. He'd be singing even now if he was here. So we can still listen to these ideas, just like we can listen and read Caged Bird from Maya Angelou. We can still listen and read from King. So we might be able to see some of those ideas. Okay, so that's an example of the critical thinking. Let me show you what I have here for brainstorming with the poem. I have kind of a web structure, and I've highlighted some things just to kind of separate it out. So we're talking about Caged Bird. And if we start with a free bird, I brought a line up here, and you can see here's the free bird. And then I started taking some of the main ideas about the analysis that I had in my notes. So like Maslow, if you add Maslow to Caged Bird, and what does it mean? What is it that the free bird had to do? Well, we know that his basic needs, he can take care of those. We know that, you know, he can kind of have a sense of feeling, maybe a sense of esteem, because he's accomplishing the things that he's setting out to do. But does he actually create? Is he fully self-actualized? According to Maslow, he doesn't have a creation. So he doesn't really have that song. He doesn't have a voice. I'm not sure if he fully is self-actualized or not. Different things we've already kind of mentioned. What about like freedom of thought? He thinks of another breeze. He's exploring his environment or maybe ideas around him. These are some of those ideas that kind of work. And do you see how I've kind of webbed them out? So this might be a main idea. Here's some supporting evidence. These kind of action verbs, I can bring elements of the text itself to help me in my description of the text. Here's some information about the caged bird. I'm trying to get all of this together for you. So if we look at the same thing, here's Maslow. So the caged bird has the basic needs met. We can kind of assume, maybe kind of extrapolate from the text, that if he's in a cage, he probably has the food, water, warmth, and rest. Though he may not feel a sense of esteem, that love and belonging. That's something that it might be missing even in the free bird. But we do know that he creates. He creates his song, his tune that's heard across a distant hill. That song of freedom is that self-actualization. Is that his creative expression? And he does have that. So that is something that the free bird doesn't have at all. So the caged bird has a song, which means he has a voice. He has a voice of freedom, but the free bird doesn't. Doesn't that kind of make you wonder? So when we look at the way that this document is, what I've done is just kind of spread out and start giving multiple ideas here. Here's the feeling of being trapped. Here's a couple different elements of the text, and then maybe some of that extra interpretation, and maybe even the critical thinking. This is just a way to allow us to have that free thinking of ideas. But I want to take it a little bit further. I just don't have a big enough paper. So I've given myself some questions to consider. So what is the caged bird song? We know it's about freedom, but how is freedom that as a concept actually defined or described in the poem? When we look at our description notes and we kind of realize that Angelo gives us that description, she is showing what freedom looks like or what it is not. She's not just telling us about it, she's not just giving us a definition, but her language is descriptive. So again, why is the caged bird the only one to sing? That could be something that you want to talk about in a paper. Why is the voice so important? What is Angelo trying to get across to the reader? This sense of voice, we remember that Angelo lost her voice after she was raped and her attacker was killed. He was beaten to death, right? And she blamed herself. In fact, she blamed her voice. And if that voice is what killed that man, then she got rid of her voice and became selectively mute. That was something for her, being able to speak and express herself, that was missing in her life, and she was getting denigrated for it. But as she learned to speak again, as she learned to express herself verbally and in writing, then she really became Maya Angelou. Is the freedom of the free bird only on the surface? Maybe there's not as much freedom as what we thought. And I asked myself, maybe what one sees as a freedom could be a cage to another person. I guess it just matters of perspective, doesn't it? Then, of course, I asked you about a historical figure. That was in the critical thinking exercise. And if you've done that well, then that person would be a good example to use to apply the poem to in your paper. But I really want you to look at what the use of language makes Angelou's work significant. It's her description that creates the meaning within the text. So, for example, the poem isn't really about two birds, is it? Or maybe even two individual people. Maybe it describes people in general, and maybe even just one person who could be free and caged at the same time. That's a pretty complex topic, but it is something that's really interesting and helps us understand the paper and the text. So remember, as you go through and you start your brainstorming and you're asking yourself how the use of description creates meanings, look at these essentials. What is the dominant impression in the text? Details that show rather than tell, all of those things. So I've got a couple examples. For instance, that dominant impression might be the feeling of being trapped or feeling hopeless versus the feeling of flight and that freedom that allows a free bird to move around and make decisions for himself. So that could be something. It could be just the comparison between the free and caged bird, freedom versus being trapped or being in jail, for instance. Now, we also know that the details that show, this could be, for example, in the poem, how about the movement of the birds? Okay, so the free bird gets to fly. He gets to follow the air currents and continue to move around as he wants. But the caged bird is in a narrow cage. He's standing behind bars of rage. He's standing on the graves of dreams. Those kind of things where he has to be still and kind of confined because his wings are clipped, his feet are tied. Those are some of those details that show. I'm just not telling you the ideas, Angelo says. I want to show you what it looks like. Engaging the senses could be things like sight, watching a bird, imagining that bird leaping on the back of the wind and floating downstream. You could see a bird take flight and understand. It's a very visual kind of description. Maybe the sense of touch as the free bird dips his wings in the orange sun rays. There's a sense of warmth and peacefulness that comes along with that. So that might be something that would engage the senses. That's not the only examples, though. So if we look at a consistent point of view, we see perspectives kind of outside, almost like in the omniscient point of view, where we're looking at these two birds' lives and giving that perspective there. We see that taking place. It's in third person, and we see the free bird and then the cage bird, then back to the free bird and the cage bird, and it ends with the cage bird. That meaningful organization is always there as well. So you can look at the text and then kind of talk about some of these ideas, how she organizes her description to really create meaning for us. And does she come up with a conclusion? What is the conclusion? So he opens his throat to sing. What is that song of freedom, and how can we talk about that? These are some of those description essentials that we see functioning in the text, so we should also see them functioning in our papers themselves. These are those ideas that I want you to kind of just keep in mind as you work and as you're kind of brainstorming those ideas together. I cannot wait to see what you guys come up with. Please know I'm still here, and you can email me, you can text me, you can call me, whenever you need to. So take a chance and really look at the text. Give yourself permission to analyze it, put it on paper. This brainstorm doesn't have to be perfect, because no brainstorm is. It has to contain just a lot of different ideas. And then I'm going to show you how to really organize those ideas into our graphic organizer. So give yourself some courage, take a chance, and write something really amazing. Have a great day. Thank you for spending your time with me.